Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. Now, before I start, I'd like to draw your attention to this poll, which is on the screen. You can pick any or as many as you wish of these three options, and I'll refer back to the results in a few minutes' time, so do be tapping away. So, as we said, my name's Peter Charlton. I'm here from King's College London, and I work jointly with Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Foundation Trust. Today I'm going to speak on the processes and benefits of sharing clinical data. And to do so, I'm going to use one particular project as a case study. This is the respiratory rate estimation project. Here you have 3 pictures of ways in which we can monitor patients' respiratory rate. That's how often they breathe in a minute. You have a chest band, a face mask, and cannulae, which sit at the end of the nostrils and mouth. And all of these pieces of apparatus give us a signal, which goes up and down as the patient breathes in and out. So with that, we can say you're breathing 20 times a minute. Now this is all well and good, but if you're walking around, you're an ambulatory patient, it's difficult to wear one of these pieces of apparatus for a long time. And yet respiratory rate is important because it changes prior to serious events, such as a heart attack. So clinicians find it useful to be able to monitor respiratory rate. An alternative approach is to use an existing signal, which is acquired for other purposes. So here we have a finger probe, with the signal that gives us, and you may recognise on the right an ECG, a heart monitor, which is commonly accompanied by a beep on your favourite hospital drama. And the science behind this is as follows. We have the original signals at the top, where each peak represents 1 heartbeat, and then below I've simulated the effect of breathing on these signals. So you can see here there's a change in the baseline, here a change in the amplitude of the signal with each breath, and here the time between each heartbeat changes with breathing. And so if you're able to extract any or all of these modulations, then you can try and estimate respiratory rate. So the aim of this project is to assess the performance of the 100+ algorithms in the literature to estimate respiratory rate from these routinely monitored signals. Here you have a reference signal that's commonly acquired using one of those bulky pieces of equipment that I showed earlier. And then you have these 2 routinely measured signals and the corresponding respiratory signal, which is derived from them. I hope you may see some similarity with the reference. But it's the secondary aims of this project which are particularly pertinent to this talk. We wanted to share firstly a benchmark dataset on which to test these algorithms. So if you as a researcher came up with your own method, you could assess its performance on this dataset. And secondly, we wanted to share standardized implementations of the existing algorithms which are in the literature, so that you could compare your algorithm's performance to those of your predecessors. So, to come back to the poll and look at the answers. Am I at the right point?
It should be 2 seconds.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for your responses. So we have so far, have you ever had clinical data recorded from you? 69%. I'll come back to this in a moment. Have you ever benefited from clinical data? 59% less. And have you ever worked with clinical data? 44%. Well, for those who have worked with clinical data before, I hope there'll be something new in this talk. For the remainder, this is a gentle introduction to the topic. As for the other 2 questions, what these are asking in disguise is what is clinical data? So, clinical data is individually identifiable health information. It's usually collected during routine patient care or during a clinical trial. and it's protected by the Common Law Duty of Confidentiality and the Data Protection Act. So I'd put it to you that almost everybody in this room has had clinical data acquired from them. If you have registered with your GP, then they hold identifiable data about you. I also asked who has benefited from clinical data. Well, clinical data provides the evidence which underpins the therapies, the drugs, the treatments that are used throughout health systems around the world. So if you've had a paracetamol tablet, then you have relied on clinical data to demonstrate the effectiveness and the safety of that tablet. So again, the benefits, I would suggest, are for us all. So firstly, the processes of sharing clinical data. To start at the beginning, when you're setting up a study, firstly, you need to determine whether or not this is clinical research. Throughout this presentation, where there's a plus symbol, that's an additional resource which is on the electronic slides which you can go to. So once you've decided whether or not it is clinical research, if it is, then you must comply with what's called the Declaration of Helsinki, which is a set of ethical and scientific principles to ensure that the study is conducted well. And you can follow these by following the practical implementation of these guidelines in good clinical practice. So to come back to our trial, how did we fulfill this? Well, firstly, our trial changed patient care. We asked patients to come into this laboratory and have these signals measured when they wouldn't be usually. And we hoped to generate generalizable findings. We recorded data from both elderly and young patients, and we hoped to extrapolate those results to the general population. So for those two reasons, it was classed as clinical research. And then to follow good clinical practice, we had the study reviewed by an ethics committee. We took informed consent, which means that potential participants were informed of what the study involved and they agreed to take part. And we published the trial design before starting data collection. Throughout all of this, cut off at the bottom, and crucially, we did not disclose participants' identities. So then, preparing to share this data. Well, we've heard earlier, you can start as early as funding applications, and this is encouraged. In addition, when you're considering the documentation that will be given to participants, you need to include details in the information sheet and in the consent form, so that participants are fully aware of what will be done with their data. Now, clinical trial data must usually be de-identified before sharing. We've heard some of the other approaches earlier on today. If you're going to take this route, then it means, firstly, it must not identify an individual, but then secondly, there must be no reasonable basis to believe that it could be used to identify an individual. Now, the difference between these two, for me, most clearly arises when you're looking at multiple data sets. So if one person already has some information publicly available in one data set and you contribute a second data set, then by piecing those together, can you identify them from that collection of data sets? And ultimately, it's the data holder who is responsible for ensuring that the participants can't be identified. So two methods from the literature. Firstly, you can ask an expert to decide whether or not there's a low enough probability that someone could be identified. Or secondly, we can remove all the identifiable information by following this recipe, which is called the safe harbor method. So this includes items such as names, dates, and many others. But we must recognize that it's not possible to ensure that the probability of re-identification is none. There's always some probability. So practically, when we're collecting data, firstly we assign a subject ID to each participant, and then in the collected data they're referred to by that subject ID rather than these identifiers. So for instance, these file names here. So having done that, collected the data, here's one example of the data which we collected in our study. And there are three areas that I'd highlight, which are either identifiable or quasi-identifiers. So firstly, the subject ID, that has to be stripped out before sharing. Secondly, this subject aged 99 had an age over 90, an outlier. Because that's relatively unusual, that has to be removed. And thirdly, these signals were recorded using dates and times. So here, date. And this helps to identify who it was who gave that data. So to correct for this, we've anonymized the subject ID, we've categorized the age as elderly rather than 99, and we've recorded time as the elapsed time since the beginning of the recording. We adopted two principles when preparing the data for analysis. Firstly, we wanted to reduce the workload and the domain-specific knowledge that was required by other researchers to use our data. But in tension with that, we wanted to retain all of the potentially useful information that we could. Although I should highlight, this doesn't usually mean putting your raw data files in the public domain. So in this trial, this is the format of one of the raw data files, which isn't that intuitive to work your way through if you've never seen it before. So we reformatted this. Secondly, the signals were recorded using different pieces of equipment, which each had different clocks. So we had to align the signals in time, again, avoiding the need for other researchers to take that step. And thirdly, we acquired data whilst participants, I'll read it for those of you at the back, were doing different activities. So firstly, they were at rest, lying on a bed, then they walked, they ran on a treadmill, and they recovered on a bed once again. And there's a lot of junk in between those periods, which isn't helpful. So we stripped out the junk and separated the recordings into those 4 periods. So now our data is ready to be shared, and the question is, how do we share it? And as we've heard earlier, there's a spectrum of options available. And these are dependent on the probability of re-identification. So as the probability of re-identification increases, so too does the level of security that's required. So at one extreme we have open access, where it's publicly available. And as we progress, we may give terms of use for users to sign up to. We may insist that they give a data analysis plan saying what they will do with the data, and we may progress to a full contract at the other extreme. What do we share? We've got the dataset, the metadata, giving the context for the data, the protocol, so how was this data collected, the study analysis plan, what did we intend to do with the data, and the analysis code, what did we do with the data. And for this particular trial, we shared the data in an open access accessible format, so it's available on this web page. And we also shared the algorithms, those other techniques for estimating respiratory rate, in a GitHub repository. We provided additional materials to try and help people to use this data. So firstly, there's a user manual, and we continuously update that as people ask questions. We add extra content to it. We've written a tutorial, which is now in press, which explains how to use the dataset with this toolbox of algorithms, and it explains how some of the algorithms work. And whenever we publish an article, we give instructions as to how to replicate this publication. Looking at the field as a whole, there are already some datasets in this field, and these other datasets can take a variety of different formats. There's no one standardized format. So we took the approach that for those which were most important, we would provide scripts which allowed you to import those datasets into the particular format that we used, so that you could perform studies across multiple datasets using this toolbox. The benefits of sharing clinical data. Well, in this project, we've increased the transparency of our work, we've increased the reproducibility, I would say there was a lot greater internal peer review prior to publication, knowing that this could be scrutinised. There's ongoing peer review externally. We sometimes receive emails asking how we did various bits. It's now required by some journals and indeed by our funding providers, so we're covering our own backs. In the future, it allows other researchers to build on our work. And this is a multidisciplinary project involving collaboration between clinicians and technical scientists. And by providing a data set, which you would usually need clinicians for, and providing the technical tools, which you would need a technically minded person for, we've made it accessible to people who don't fall into both camps. And as I've said, we can perform multiple dataset studies. We're promoting collaboration. We've had people getting in touch, looking to collaborate. We hope this will increase the speed of research, so in that goal to be able to monitor respiratory rate. We can now ask new research questions of this dataset, so I am looking at it for a completely different purpose at the same time. Decreased burden on research subjects. So those subjects who gave up their time to contribute this data are seeing greater reward for their contribution. And finally, the education of students. I hope that this is the sort of project that undergrads, masters might want to reproduce and build on themselves. And I hope we've provided the materials to facilitate that. So to conclude, I've considered the processes for collection and sharing of clinical trial data, using this project as a case study. I've looked briefly at the benefits of sharing clinical data, and there are links available to these slides and other resources. Now, it's unusual in a presentation that the most important slide is the acknowledgements, but here it is. You'll notice how long the column of clinicians is that worked on this project, and my number one tip for sharing clinical data would be to work with clinicians. So with my thanks to the clinicians, the engineers and the funders, and additional acknowledgements, I'll point you towards the references and the additional resources which are available. Thank you.
Right, so we have 5 minutes for questions. If people want to raise a hand.
You used GitHub to share your data. How useful was this for you? Because GitHub at the moment is mostly for sharing code, not really data. It's used in the developer, in the IT community.
I should clarify. We didn't use GitHub to share the data. So we used GitHub to share the algorithms, the code. The data, I confess, is in a primitive way of sharing, where we've put it onto OneDrive on Microsoft, and then you click the link via our website and you can download the file. In the long term, once we're confident that we've got the data set in the best possible way for other people to use it, I hope to move over to a DOI.
There's a question down the front here.
Well, thank you. That was like the best practice example of how to do it, really. So it's really hard to come up with questions. So my question is, like, who did all this work? Did you have a lot of research assistants to kind of assist with this, or who kind of compiled all the files and made sure that everything follows all the logs of the study analysis plan that you had in the beginning? We had many research assistants helping with collecting the data, but once it was collected in an electronic format. From that point onwards, I did all of the processing. Cool. Yeah, really well done.
Thank you.
Okay, so I would have a final question, which is, what would you do if you couldn't de-identify your data?
So I showed the spectrum of different options for making your data available. And what we're saying there is that the probability of re-identification has increased. So we move along that spectrum. So to give you an example, there is a data set of tens of thousands of patients staying in hospital from Boston, Massachusetts, where they ask you to sign up to a terms of use, and you have to undergo a short qualification online before you can have access. That's moving along the spectrum. But then we've also had examples among us today of where you can hold the data within your own environment and people can interact on the internet, but they can't take the data for themselves. And simply, we need to progress along that line. So for instance, in a hospital, if you have a Premiership footballer who has just experienced an unusual injury on the pitch, and yet you want to make their data publicly available, then obviously it's very hard to de-identify that information, that this was a footballer who came from a match, had this problem. And so there, sometimes I don't have an answer as to how you could share that with the wider public.